Hey everybody, we're going to jump right into Linda Hand, Chapter 6. We just got done, Molly was in class, and she introduced us to a teacher, Miss Campbell. Let's see what Linda Hand is about. That is Chapter 6. The day dragged on forever after the multiplication bee. At lunch, Molly felt as if she had a sore throat. That's how I kind of feel. She opened her lunch bag and looked inside. Mrs. Guilford had packed a peanut butter and jelly sandwich. Molly took a bite. It got stuck in her throat. She decided she was probably getting the mumps. Luckily, hopefully, the mumps, you know, vaccinations, mumps, we won't even get into it. Okay. In reading, which was usually Molly's favorite subject, she didn't get a chance to read out loud because Mrs. Campbell stopped the reading group early. Mrs. Campbell stood in front of the room and raised both hands, the signal for quiet. All the rustling and chair squeaking and whispers stopped when she said, "Class, I have a special announcement to make. If I may have your attention, please." Molly looked up. A special announcement. It was something good. She could tell because Mrs. Campbell's face looked pink and pleased. Our class has been invited to participate in a school-wide contest. It's called the Lend a Hand Contest. Every student is challenged to lend a hand to help the war effort. Every class will be divided into teams. You may divide yourself into teams in any way you wish. Boys against girls, said Howie. Definitely. Boys against girls, all the boys murmured in agreement. Mrs. Campbell waited for quiet. Well, that will be fine if that's the way you want to do it. You may choose any kind of project you wish, but it must be something to help our soldiers in the war effort. At the end of the contest, the winning team will receive an award at a school assembly. Now, you have only one weekend to do the project from start to finish. Plan your projects today, work on them tomorrow, bring them in on Monday. Remember, you will be competing against boys and girls in the 4th and 5th grades, so be sure you choose a very good project to do and work hard on it. The classroom was awash in a sea of voices as the teams discussed different ideas for their projects. Linda waved to Susan while Allison whispered to Grace. Woody sat on top of his desk talking to Howie over Grace's head. Then Susan leaned over to Molly. "What should we do?" she asked. "I don't know," said Molly. She tried to think of a spectacular project. Collect $1,000 and buy a war bond? No, too hard. Roll bandages? Too boring. Collect newspapers? Everyone did that. Oh, the third grade girls had to win the contest. Just just think how Mrs. Campbell would be. Molly would work harder than anyone else on the project, and then when they won, she'd have her picture in the newspaper, probably with Mrs. Campbell. Third grade girl lends a big hand to war effort. It would say under the picture, and Mrs. Campbell would send the picture to the soldier she was engaged to, and he would write back, "Let's ask Molly to be in our wedding." "That's a wonderful idea, Allison," Mrs. Campbell was saying. "I think that's a fine project. You certainly have your thinking cap on today." On the blackboard, Mrs. Campbell wrote, "Girls, knit socks." Knit socks, Molly thought. That's a terrible idea. Molly knew all about knitting socks. Well, she didn't really know all about it, but she knew it was hard. Molly had struggled through knitting lessons with Mrs. Guilford. She had not been able to finish even one sock. Socks took a long time. They were complicated by the they were complicated. By the time Mrs. Guilford finished a sock, it looked as if it had already marched a million miles. The third grade girls would never win the contest if they chose knitting socks as their project. Molly brought her hand down. Oh, wait a minute. Molly had to say something, but as she started to raise her hand, Susan leaned over and whispered, "Won't that be fun? We can make hundreds of socks if we all knit this weekend." Molly brought her hand down. No one would listen to her now. All the other girls were gathered into a bunch around Allison's desk. They decided to unravel old sweaters to make or ask their mothers for yarn scraps they could use. Allison was smiling and nodding, writing something on a piece of paper. That Allison, thought Molly. It would be her idea, always trying to get on the good side with Mrs. Campbell. While Molly wasn't going to let Allison tell her what to do, she wasn't going to let Allison lead all the girls in the class into some dumb project that wouldn't even work. Molly sat at her desk, thinking hard. It wasn't easy to concentrate because all around her the boys were talking loudly about their project. Woody Halsey wanted to dig an air raid shelter for the school. All we need would be some shovels, he kept saying. Howie's idea finally won out. He suggested the boys collect tinfoil and send it to be made into tanks and trucks for the soldiers. We'll make a ball of tinfoil 6 feet wide, he said grandly. We'll roll it up the aisle during the assembly. The boys were impressed. On the blackboard, Mrs. Campbell wrote, "Boys, collect tinfoil for ball." When the dismissal bell rang, Mrs. Campbell said, "Thank you for working hard today. Good luck on your projects. Now line up quietly. I'll see you Monday." Molly led the line of third graders marching down the stairs and out the school building into the pale November sunshine. Knit socks, she thought. It's a bad idea. It really is. Molly didn't think that just because it was Allison's idea either. She hopped on one she hopped on one foot and then the other, waiting for Linda and Susan. I won't I won't knit socks, Molly decided. I'll think up another project that will win the contest. Then Allison and Mrs. Campbell will see who has her thinking cap on. Molly, Linda, and Susan usually walked home together. On most days they stopped and played at Molly's house because Mrs. Gifford was there to keep an eye on them. Mrs. McIntyre usually did not get home from her job at the Red Cross until dinner time, and both Linda's mother and Susan's mother worked in an airplane factory every afternoon. When the girls got to the back door of Molly's house, Molly flung it open, took a deep breath, and shouted, "Hooray! Bread day!" Mrs. Guilford replied with three brisk commands. "Come in, wipe your feet, sit at the table like ladies." The kitchen was steamy. It smelled like warm raisins. Mrs. Guilford stood at the table behind an army of bowls and measuring cups. She nodded to the girls and pointed with the end of her wooden spoon to the 3 plates on the table in front of them. "There are your sample slices," she said. On each plate was a thick, red-brown piece of bread, heavy with fat raisins. "It's round," said Susan. "Boston brown bread," replied Mrs. Guilford. Baked in an old coffee tin, and not a speck of sugar or butter in it." Molly picked up her piece of bread and took a bite. "Mmm, this is a good one, Mrs. Guilford." "I like this bread too," said Linda. "Me too," said Susan. "It tastes like Christmas." "I like the smell," said Molly, with her mouth full. "If I had perfume, I'd want it to smell just as excellent as this." "Humph! You probably have all the dogs in the neighborhood following you around," snorted Mrs. Guilford, but Molly could tell she was pleased. Making bread was one of the things Mrs. Guilford did to help the war effort. Every week she tried a new bread recipe. Molly and Linda and Susan were her official tasting committee. Out of all the breads Mrs. Guilford had tried so far, only one had not met everyone's approval. That was red bread made with tomato juice. Molly and Linda begged Miss Guilford never to make it again. Susan voted for it because it was pink. Making bread from scratch during wartime was not easy. Mrs. Guilford had to figure out substitutes for some ingredients that weren't hard to get, like butter and sugar. But Mrs. Guilford rose to the challenge just as her loaves of bread rose high and brown and delicious. Of all the changes the war had brought to the McIntyre household, the only one Molly could absolutely positively say she liked was Mrs. Guilford's homemade bread. One second. I'm sorry, it's so dry today. Mm. Today, Mrs. Guilford had a pamphlet called How to Bake by the Ration Book propped up between a milk bottle and a sack of flour. Molly watched Mrs. Guilford sifting some flour through a strainer. She was making a small snowstorm fall right into a bowl in the kitchen. Oh, I'm sorry, on the kitchen table. It looked like fun. You could make a mess, but it wouldn't get you into trouble. Can I sift it? She asked Miss Gifford. May I sift it? And no, you may not. Not in your school clothes. You'd be covered all over with flour. Trot upstairs, put on your play clothes, and then you may sign up to be a dough boy. That would take too much time, said Linda. I don't think I'd better, said Molly. We have to work on our project. Mrs. Gilford looked up. What project? Well, there's a lend a hand contest at school. We're supposed to do a project to help the war effort. We only have this weekend to do it. Whoever does the best project wins a prize, explained Molly. And what's your project? Said Mrs. Guilford with interest. We don't know yet, said Molly. Yes, we do, said Susan. She gave Molly a puzzled look. We're knitting socks. Hundreds and hundreds of socks, just like you do, Mrs. Guilford. Mrs. Guilford poured milk into a measuring cup. I see, she said. Well, all good luck to you. You may take another slice of bread if you wish. No crumbs on the floor, please. Come to me if you decide you need knitting needles or yarn. Thank you, Mrs. Guilford, the girls said. They each took another slice of bread. Then they went outside and walked over to the garage. There was a storage room above the garage, and the girls liked to talk there. It was a private place they used as a clubhouse. They climbed the stairs to the storage room, already nibbling their second slices of bread. So that's chapter 6, guys. Like I said, we're going to get through it. There's 12 chapters total, and thank you for all you do. I'll see y'all on the flip side. Bye, all.